Hello, friends. Christ is risen. He truly is risen. Today, I want to ask the question, why is Orthodox Christian worship so fancy? The reason that I want to talk about this is that a lot of people look at Orthodox worship, other Christians perhaps, but maybe some other people, and they object. They say, what is the deal with all of this gold, all of this finery, these incredibly ornate buildings, all of this stuff, right? Lots of stuff and lots of very expensive stuff. Why is it so fancy? And why is the chanting so ornate? Why is the liturgy so complicated? Why is all this fanciness there, this ornateness, right? This makes me think about my favorite Indiana Jones film, which is Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the last really good one, in my opinion. And there's a point where Indiana Jones, the hero of the story, he gets into this cave, and which is inside Petra, which is in Jordan, and he's looking to find the true Holy Grail, right? The actual cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper in the Gospels. And he's looking, and there's all these different cups that are there. And there's some very, very ornate ones. And then finally, he discovers one that's super, super plain. And he looks at it and says, now there's the cup of a carpenter, right? So he's looking for the one that is simple and plain and would connect with his image of who Jesus is. And he takes it and he puts some water in it and he drinks from it. And of course, it turns out that it is indeed the Holy Grail, and it cures him of disease and cures people's wounds and all that kind of stuff. And this idea that the right Grail should be this very simple cup, I think that feeds into why some people object to the ornateness of Orthodox Christian worship, and frankly, the ornateness of Christian worship, historically speaking, throughout most of time and across most Christian cultures, just about everywhere. And so there's this idea, this image of Jesus as he was a simple person, nothing fancy about him. And so therefore, worship connected with him should also be simple, right? And then connected with this idea is that in the Old Testament, that worship in Israel was all of this very ornate, complicated stuff, and Jesus came to release us from all that, to save us from all of that. And so therefore, the idea that Christians would want to go back to that seems like a kind of betrayal, right, of what it is that Jesus came to offer, this very simple, pure, direct connection to God. So that's one of the objections that people have. An additional objection that some people have is they might say, all that money that's being spent on these incredibly fancy vestments and all this gold and, these fancy altars, fancy churches, fancy iconography, all of that money would be much better spent on people who could use it, right? So feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, all of these good things. So that's another objection. And then also you can hear some people that say, well, doesn't all that kind of get between you and God? Like, just give me the straight, pure, perfect, direct connection to God. Like, why do I need all this stuff that gets in between? It's a distraction. And indeed, some people would even go so far as to say that's idolatry, like you're worshiping stuff. You're bowing down in front of stuff, right? Well, I want to talk about all these things. Well, so first, let's begin here. I think the easiest one probably to address is this question of money being better spent on the poor. First thing that you should know is that Christians of whatever variety, Christians are the most charitable people in the world. Now, I'm not saying that they are charitable enough. I'm not saying that at all, right? But this idea that Christians don't care about the poor, that they don't care about the needy, that's simply false. Absolutely, you can find plenty that is their attitude. But there are numerous and huge and very active Christian charities that are doing all kinds of amazing, beautiful things. And in many cases, they're doing that while also having ornate worship, right? So these things are not inherently contradictory with each other. Now, again, could we be doing more? Should we be doing more? Yes and yes, absolutely. But when you look at the commands that God gives, and I'm going to talk about this some more, but the commands that God gives about worship in the Old Testament, they are never set in opposition to the commands that he also gives about taking care of those who are in need. Right? These are not commands from God that should be set against each other. So there's no reason that one has to only put the effort and the resources into one thing and not the other. We should be doing both. We absolutely should be doing both, right? And also, I should point out that the person in the Gospels that actually objects to costliness being spent on an act of love and veneration and so forth for Jesus, and says that these should be given to the poor, that's Judas. Judas is the one who sets these things in opposition to each other. So just putting that out there. The idea that these things get between you and God, I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go, because I want to discuss how we got here, okay? And why I believe that ornateness in worship does not get between me and God. Doesn't have to. It isn't idolatry. It's not a distraction, all that sort of stuff, right? And the place I want to begin is by talking about worship in the Old Testament. And worship is mentioned many times in the Old Testament, but if you want to look at the places where Israel is worshiping God and when they're worshiping him faithfully, because of course there's plenty of times that they're not worshiping him faithfully, they sometimes attempt to worship him with idolatry, like think of the golden calf stuff. They sometimes worship other gods, right? There's worship of various pagan gods that happens in Israel, but when they actually are following the commands, and if you look at what the commands are, you will see that worship is anything but simple. It is anything but plain. It is extremely ornate. And here's the important bit, it is commanded by God to be that way. God gives detailed commands on vestments. He gives detailed commands on an incredibly ornate worship space called the tabernacle. He gives detailed commands on the Ark of the Covenant. He gives detailed commands on various kinds of sacrifices of animals, of grain, of incense, of drink, all of these things. God commands ancient Israel to have extremely ornate worship. It simply is a command from him. And so since this is a command from him, the idea that it is inherently bad, that it is inherently idolatrous, that it is inherently distracting, that idea makes no sense. Because if it is inherently those things, then why would God have commanded that to begin with? He wasn't trying to mislead Israel. He was commanding them in the way that he expected to be worshipped. That's what he expected, right? Now, I want to talk about idolatry for just a second. What exactly is idolatry? This is a big subject, but here's a very brief summary. Idolatry is the use of images as bodies of gods that then get taken care of and worshipped in an attempt to get something from that god. And there was actually a ceremony that was done to try to breathe the spirit of the god into the image, usually a statue, right? And this statue was regarded as being actually a body for the god that its worshipers could use to interact with the god and get what they wanted out of him. And so ancient Israel, of course, was commanded not to engage in idolatry at all. But that doesn't mean that they did not use very ornate things in their worship, including images. But they did not regard those images as being bodies of God. They didn't worship the images. They didn't offer sacrifices to the images. They didn't do those things, right? So it's not inherently idolatry to have images in worship. It's not inherently idolatry to have complex sacrificial worship, liturgical worship. That is not inherently idolatry. Again, these are things that God himself commanded. Go look in Exodus and Leviticus and see exactly how God describes. It goes on and on. Look and see exactly how God describes what he expects of the people of Israel. There's images there, there's ornateness there, there's complexity there, there's liturgy there. All of that stuff is there. That's worship in the Old Testament. Okay, so that is stuff that God himself commanded. You can't get around that. Now, you might say, okay, well, God commanded that in the Old Testament, but he means something new now in the New Testament, right? Jesus, very simple guy, not a wealthy man, and he's traveling around with his disciples. He has no place to lay his head, right? So he's not a guy who's like showing off his wealth. He doesn't even have any to begin with, and so you get this image again of the simple cup of the carpenter, right? So obviously Jesus means that all of that Old Testament era worship is now over, and now there's something new, something much simpler, something with a lot less complexity, something very plain. Here's the question I have for people who say that, who usually largely believe in what's called sola scriptura, which means, we go by the Bible alone. I don't believe in that because I'm an Orthodox Christian, but people who would make this objection, they will say that. I'll say, where's that in the Bible? Where is it? There's no place in the New Testament where it says, stop all that stuff and now do something very simple, something very, very plain. It never says that. Never says that. We have a number of clues as to exactly how the earliest Christians worshiped. Number one, we know that they continued to worship in the temple even after the resurrection of Jesus. Even after that. So that didn't mean that the liturgical worship of the Old Testament was suddenly over, right? Now, they didn't continue to go to the temple after it was destroyed in the year 70, for sure. We know that. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a minute. But they did continue to go to the temple, and they worshiped there in the temple. They participated in all of that complex ritual with all of that glorious ornament and so forth. Jesus could have said to them, it's over. Stop it. Don't go there anymore. But they continued to do that even after his resurrection, even after his ascension into heaven. Early Christians participated in that, right? Now, you might look at the Last Supper, what in Orthodox Christian circles we tend to call the mystical supper. You might look at that moment when Christ institutes the Eucharist and say, see, well, that was a very simple kind of scenario, It was very plain. Again, we don't actually have a lot of details about exactly what went on there. We don't. So you can't actually use that as an argument one way or the other. I'm not going to say that it was this incredibly complex ornate ritual. I don't know that either from what's actually there. We just don't have anything either way. But what we do know is that Jesus said, do this as my remembrance. That's a better translation, by the way, than do this in remembrance of me. Why is that important? As you can see, many places in the Old Testament, to remember someone before God or to have memorials before God was language that was used to describe making sacrifices to God as the way that you would worship your God, as you would remember the people before him, that you would have memorials before him. But it doesn't mean just like recalling in your head, like, oh yeah, I remember that, think about this when you, no, that's not what that means. It is rather that this use of memory is part of this complex ritual of worship. So when Jesus says, do this as my remembrance, he's saying, okay, you've been doing remembrances. You've been doing the system of sacrifices that were given in Leviticus and Exodus and so forth. You've been doing that. Now this is what I expect. I expect you to use bread and wine in this way. And in this way, we will have communion. And he says, I will be with you always to the end of the age. That this binds him and his followers together. Right? So what you see there in the Eucharist is a sacrifice. You see this shared meal of bread and wine between their God, who is sitting there in the flesh as a man, and the ones who are worshiping him. Do this as my remembrance. Again, it's not some simple plain thing. It's an act of sacrifice. And of course, there's a whole matrix of sacrifice that they understand it already to be. And there's no place in the Gospels where Jesus says, you're not doing liturgy anymore. You're not doing ritual anymore. There's no place in the epistles of Paul where he says that to them. There's all kinds of indications otherwise. He talks about the blessing of the cup and the bread. And obviously, St. Paul is participating in the Eucharist. There's no indication in any of the New Testament scriptures that worship is now suddenly supposed to become this radically different kind of thing. It's never said. A big change like that needs to be commanded. Never commanded. Never commanded. And we actually know about what worship is like even after the New Testament period. Right? So for instance, in the writings of St. Ignatius of Antioch, St. Ignatius, who was a disciple of the Apostle John, so the very next generation of Christian, very next generation, he talks about a worship life centered on the Eucharist. He talks about a worship life led by bishops. It's very clear that this is a continuation of the sacrificial worship from the Old Covenant, but now transformed to the New Covenant and focused on the Eucharist. We actually have a kind of order of service from the middle of the 2nd century from an early writer named St. Justin Martyr, and he describes what worship on Sunday looked like for Christians. And it's clearly ritual, very clearly. Like he gives a step-by-step description. It's not the whole thing, but it's kind of a general outline. So we know that the first Christians, continuing on into the 2nd century, were worshiping liturgically. They were worshiping with ritual, and they were doing the best that they could with it. Okay? And there's two things I want to say about that. One is, it's true that in the 2nd century, we don't have huge church edifices, right? Why? Christianity is still kind of mostly illegal and mostly dominated by people who are not very well off. So they didn't have the resources to build big temples. They didn't have them. But we do know that when whatever resources they had, they dedicated them in the best way possible. Okay, so for instance, there's indications in the catacombs in Rome where there was worshiping going on there, where they were painting iconography on the walls. It was clearly indications of the liturgy being celebrated in these places. There are house churches that are discovered, but house churches doesn't mean some suburban place where everyone's gathering around a coffee table. No, house churches that we've actually discovered archaeologically, there is a room set aside and set up for worship. Temple, place to baptize people, iconography on the walls, Christian inscriptions. They are doing the most that they can with the resources that they have. It is a dedicated, set-aside worship space. It's not like throw up a card table and then take it down when we're done, right? They are doing the most that they could with what they have. It's only after Christianity becomes legal and you start having a little bit more in the way of financial resources that you start getting much more complex churches and this sort of thing. But it's just an extension of what they were already doing with whatever it is that they had. The other thing I want to say about that question of doing your best is that it's interesting to me that a lot of the people who object to the ornateness of Christian worship, of Orthodox Christian worship, they object to that, saying it needs to be simple, whatever, and yet they have no problem with making their own homes as ornate as possible. They expect the church to be plain, and then their home is actually a nice, comfortable, beautiful place to be. Okay? They would have no problem, for instance, making a university buildings beautiful and glorious and ornate, or a theater, a traditional theater. I don't mean cinema. Traditional theater, beautiful, ornate, glorious. Government buildings, beautiful, ornate, glorious. But when it comes to church, no. It needs to be 4 bare walls, and the sermon needs to be simple, simple, simple. Which means that when it comes to almost everything else in life, we want to do our best. And yet, with the thing that is the most important, worshiping God, we'll do good enough. Not best. Not best. Well, in fact, let's suppress it. Let's make it less than good. Make it, very poor and plain. That's a weird contradiction. Weird contradiction, right? That's like if you were courteous and kind and wonderful to almost everyone in your life, but when it came to your wife or your husband, nothing, just the bare bones. That makes no sense. That's messed up priorities. It's messed up priorities. We do our best for God. We do our best. We give him the most glorious thing that we can. Right? Now, some people would say, this is another objection related to this question of, money for the poor and that sort of thing. Some people will say, well, again, that should be for the poor. Well, here's the thing. Beautiful church buildings are for the poor. They're for everyone, actually. And historically speaking, a beautiful building, a truly beautiful, ornate building, was actually off limits to most people. Only the powerful, the rich, the important could go to those kinds of places. The poor were not welcome. But a Christian church has always welcomed everyone. That's what it's for, right? Everyone is welcome to be there. So this is beauty that is accessible to even the poorest person, right? A beauty that it would probably is not accessible to them otherwise, So it is actually an offering for the poor. So it's not just that we can do this and feed and clothe the poor. It's actually that beautiful worship is an offering to the poor. It is something that we give not in a condescending way, because it's really for everyone, but it is an experience that they can have along with everyone else. They're truly equal in that place before God and experiencing the same thing before God, right? You don't have to pay to get in. It's not like any of that kind of stuff. So we give God all that is our best, right? Now, I've described in brief worship in the Old Covenant, worship in the New Covenant, worship in the early church, and some of the reasons why some of these objections don't make any sense. But I actually haven't really gotten to the why. Okay, I've begun, a little bit by saying we give God our best, but let's get to the real why of it. Why is it that God told Israel to make worship this incredibly ornate, complex ritual? Why is it that the early church continued to do that, although in a transformed way? They didn't throw away everything and then do something completely new. They transformed what they had received to make it centered completely on Christ and on the commands that he gave. Do this as my remembrance, right? But why is it? Why is that appropriate? It's not only because this is the best that we can do. Because some people might say, well, I think something else is better. They might say that's not our best. Setting aside for a moment what God actually commanded. But why is it? Well, when you look in the scripture, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and you look at visions that prophets and apostles had of what heaven is like, what you see there is not something plain. It is not something simple. It is something glorious. It is something that is beauty beyond almost the comprehension of humanity. God gives visions to the prophets and the apostles of what heaven is like, of what worship in heaven is like, led by the angels, focused on the one who is on the throne. There's an altar there. I mean, all of these things are there. You look at the visions of Isaiah, of the Apostle John, and so on and so forth. This communion with God in this place of utter glory and matchless beauty, this astonishing ornateness. That's what heaven is like. And so when mankind worships God here on earth, what we are doing is actually obeying the words of the Lord's Prayer. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. As it is in heaven. That doesn't just mean that God is obeyed on earth and he's obeyed in heaven. It's that he's obeyed in particular kinds of ways. And the most important way that he's obeyed is worship. And we know what worship in heaven looks like. And let me be frank, it does not look like a rock and roll concert. It does not look like a bunch of people sitting around in a living room having a get together. That is not what worship in heaven looks like. We know what it looks like. We see it in Scripture. And so the question that I would have for you, if you think, well, I prefer this, is why would you want to worship God in a different way than the angels do? Why would you want to do something different than the saints in heaven are doing? And what if you could do that here and now? Now, it's in many ways lesser than what they're doing because, frankly, we're sinful. Frankly, we don't have infinite resources. But shouldn't we reach as high as we possibly can? Absolutely, we should. Absolutely, we should. Now, if all someone has is that card table in a living room and, secondhand, third-hand vestments, whatever, if that's all they truly have, is that wrong to use that? It's not wrong, because the point is to give the most that we possibly have. But one thing that you'll notice about Orthodox churches is that they give the most that they have, and when they do have some more, then they do more, right? They don't settle for doing something that's pretty good. That's not what Orthodox Christians do. We give our best because we worship the highest. And we worship him in a way that is not only in obedience to his commands, but is also joining us with the worship that is happening in heaven. And when we do that, we are there. We are there. God bless you.